It looks like we are going to get started here. We've got almost 154 attendees and still climbing. So thank you for being here. So welcome to the Foundation for Advancing Alcohol Responsibility, or responsibility.org's launch of its high-risk impaired driver program known as StopHRID.org. I am your host, Darren Grondell, Vice President for Traffic Safety and Government Relations. We're honored to have over 150 people on the call from around the country, and I was recently in contact with a police chief from the South Pacific and who is going to be joining us. So regardless of where you're from, we welcome you, and we also want to know that we are here to support and assist you. So thank you for being on the call as we continue to work together to address the ongoing plague of impaired driving. A few housekeeping items. The video has been disabled on your end and audio muted except for the presenters. We'll be sharing the screen so you can follow the presentations. If you are new to Zoom, if you hover your mouse towards the bottom of the presentation screen, you should have a menu appear and you will see a chat box. You can write in your questions. Leslie is monitoring the chat box for questions, and at the conclusion of the presentations, we will address as many as time permits. This webinar is being recorded, so you can go back and listen, share with your colleagues and others to review some of the slides. We would like to give a special thanks to the expert working group who developed the title and content for this report, which is getting a lot of attention. We are deeply honored and appreciative of your willingness to engage in this webinar launch, because too many people have lost their lives or lost loved ones in this totally preventable crime. We have several disciplines from the DUI system represented here on this call, and it will take all of us working together to stop impaired driving and to stop high-risk impaired driving. Next slide. Responsibility.org. Got the slide? There we go. Responsibility.org started their successful efforts over 28 years ago, and many of you may recall, go back to the other slide, recall the original name as the Century Council. We attribute our success to the support, encouragement, and commitment from our member companies, partners, advisory board, and the millions of teachers, parents, and kids across the country who have used our programs and products. Responsibility.org's mission is to lead efforts to eliminate underage drinking, be a national thought and action-driven leader to eliminate drunk and impaired driving, and inspire a lifetime of responsibility for those that use alcohol. Next slide. This just outlines many of our member companies, and we appreciate their continual support for the work that we do to positively affect people's lives and to reduce impaired driving and save lives. Next slide. Since 1982, a lot of efforts have been put forth through strong advocacy, national and state policy, training, funding, and other efforts have resulted in a dramatic decrease in the number of traffic deaths due to impairment. However, over the past decade, we have remained relatively plateaued. Impaired driving needs to be a priority for policymakers, leaders, and our communities. In 2019, the U.S. suffered 36,120 traffic fatalities. Over a third, or around 11,000 people, were killed due to impaired driving. It is time we all join forces to make this more like a pandemic and put the policies, funding, and programs and research in place to once and for all end impaired driving. Thus, today's launch of our high-risk impaired driving report. Next slide. In referring to high-risk impaired drivers, we want to make this point very clear. We recognize that every and all impaired drivers pose a high risk, and nothing in this report should suggest or infer we are not talking about that. This is always a priority and one of our key focuses. There are a lot of resources and countermeasures that work that address this portion of the DUI system. We also recognize that 2/3 of offenders will not recidivate. However, approximately a third will. This report is addressing a gap in some of our work in addressing those areas, which are, especially with high-risk impaired drivers, we're referring to repeat offenders. those with high blood alcohol concentrations, those that use multiple substances or polysubstance use, and finding ways to identify high-risk drivers on the first arrest. In essence, this launch helps to enhance the whole DUI system. Next slide. In our launch, we will have a tremendous amount of resources to include this message and short video.
Booking officer Kim felt tired, even for the middle of the night shift. He'd seen too many of these offender types brought into the station lately. The drivers with extremely high blood alcohol content, the drivers impaired by multiple substances, and the repeat offenders. He knew these high-risk impaired drivers were more likely to be involved in deadly crashes, and he knew they were likely to avoid accountability and drive impaired again. After all, DUI cases were typically assigned to the most inexperienced prosecutors, even though they were among the most complex crimes to prosecute successfully. Cases usually result in cookie-cutter punishments, like fines, temporary license suspension, or limited jail sentences, rather than more effective individualized sanctions. And since state laws don't always permit active monitoring, offenders often don't comply with their sentences, ignoring abstinence requirements, failing to install ignition interlocks, and skipping sobriety tests or probation appointments. Research tells us that an individualized approach involving screening, assessment, active monitoring, and treatment is far more effective in holding impaired drivers accountable and changing their behavior. This deters repeat DUI offenses and protects public safety. These critical but underutilized steps help to identify underlying causes that could contribute to the decision to drive while impaired, including mental health conditions and substance abuse problems. And they should guide decisions on release, sentencing, supervision, and treatment. Research shows that this approach works, even for the offenders most resistant to behavior change. The technology and tools are available, so with wider adoption, we could reduce recidivism, encourage recovery, produce long-term behavioral changes, and, ultimately, make the road safer for everyone.
Next slide. So that's just one of the resources that we have in our launch for stophrid.org. It addresses the DUI system in phases. If you could go back to the previous slide, and you will find a series of interactive online resources that maps out the impaired driving system from point of arrest to behavior change. It helps identify the various DUI system challenges and propose changes for critical reforms. It stresses the importance of screening and assessment, not just for alcohol, but for multi-substances and looking at the person holistically. Provides online database of promising programs and provides policymakers and agency administrators checklists that they can use to support their own DUI systems. Also addresses some of the data and collection and analysis, which we know is a weak point around impaired driving, and also additional video resources. So today, to help us to launch this, we have convened an amazing panel of speakers. To start with the Honorable Judge Michael Barrace from Lackawanna, Pennsylvania, and Chief Stephen Cass-Stevens from Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and President of the International Association of Chief of Police, and Joanne Tomka, Director of the National Traffic Law Center. So, Judge Barrace, I know we all agree that every impaired driver poses a high risk on the road. Can you describe what we mean when we say high-risk impaired drivers?
Well, obviously, as you had mentioned, everyone that's driving impaired is a serious danger, but we know that those that are the highest risk in regard to reoffending and death and injury on our highways is those individuals that we have recognized as high risk impaired. And that can be those individuals that are driving, whether it be combined multiple drugs or drugs and alcohol. Those with a BAC above 0.15, which is a factor of 60% of all the impaired driving deaths. or repeat drivers while impaired, and they cause approximately a third of all impaired drivers. So when we're looking at who is causing the most mayhem on the streets and our highways, it's that high-risk impaired driver. And therefore, we as a criminal justice system have to identify those who we see are at the highest risk and see how we then apply our respective disciplines to stopping those drivers and changing their behaviors. In doing that, the biggest thing for the court system as we move forward, if we are truly going to make sure our sentences are important and making sure that our monitoring and probationary terms are correct, is that we are able to apply the tools of an early assessment of a validated tool. So what I mean by that is the courts themselves. Years ago, Johnny would come in, it's a second or third DUI, and a judge would say, you need this treatment, you need inpatient, you need outpatient. Well, that's not really the job of either the prosecutor, the judge, or obviously the police officer. We need to make sure that we have the experts, just like going to the doctor's office, we need to have the professionals tell us what level of care a person needs. But more importantly, we have to make sure that we are having the individuals get an early assessment. We don't want to wait until sentencing. We don't want to wait until a year or two when they go back out on the street umpteen times in between and offend again. So the court has to make sure that there is an early assessment using validated tools to see whether or not this person is part of the 1/3 or the 2/3, because we certainly don't have enough wherewithal to give everyone nor should we, a cookie-cutter approach to treatment. So we have to make sure that we are targeting those high-risk impaired drivers by making sure an early assessment is done and then making sure that they are placed in the correct level of care. Because the only way we're going to change their behaviors is by making sure we're getting to the root problem, and that is often either their abuse of substances or alcohol and or their mental health problems. So if we're for years and years, all we ever looked at is saying, well, a drunk driver, and many of the programs, all they would do is have canned films, and they'd have educational programs in regard to the dangers of drunk driving, and the person would sit there for an hour or two, they get their certificate, they go out the door, and the criminal justice system said, well, we did our job, we made them go address the problem, but really all we did was put a little Band-Aid on it, we didn't even address the problem, and that's because they weren't getting the correct not only assessment, but they weren't getting the treatment that matched up with their assessments. Today, we are fortunate enough that now many new instruments, many new tools have come out that are validated, that are looking strictly at the DUI offender. And that's a big difference. Many of the tools that have been used in the past were a blanket drug and alcohol, and was not looking at the factors that we know are often represented in the 1/3 of the individuals that are the high risk. So whether it be a mental health problem, whether it be other things that aren't being identified, we now today have between the impaired driving assessment and the CARS tool, we are able to look at DUI specific drug and alcohol and mental health concerns that are associated with the high risk drivers so that we can place them in the correct level of care, and that the courts then through a DUI court or otherwise can be focusing their attention on the 1/3 that we know are the high risk as compared to the others. Darren, you're on mute. Darren.
Who does the assessments for those?
Okay, well, obviously, depending upon where you're at, your drug and alcohol commissions in particular cities or counties, but it has to be someone that has a drug and alcohol certified individual that's able to take a look at for the drug and alcohol assessment. But now with many of the new ones that are out, the IDA as well as the CARS, we aren't looking at necessarily having them wait to get an appointment to get into a drug and alcohol facility. But now we are looking at online web-based instruments that are basically they can do from a computer or a kiosk. You can do it with a probation officer. You could do it with a screening individual. It can be done in your pretrial programs. It can be done really just about anywhere. And we no longer have the excuse to say, well, we can't get into the treatment center to get the accurate assessment. And we don't have the problems that we had years ago. Often if they went to facility A, all of a sudden they were assessed for whatever facility A gave. And there was a huge conflict of interest. With these tools that are out there today, that doesn't exist. It's not a self-referral tool by these organizations, but rather it identifies, first of all, the levels of care. Second of all, something like CARS will also tell you what other where you can go in your community to get the resources you need to address the underlying problems. So it's more of a individualized program, and it's tailored to the needs of the individual. When I say needs, one thing that we've always done for years and years was say, what risk is this person to the community? And so obviously a drunk driver that's killed somebody is always considered to be high risk. Well, that's not really the definition of high risk. We really have to look more at, there's the ongoing risk factors, and then there are some that are inherent in the individual because of them growing up and what's occurred during that, and we can measure both the static ones and the non-static ones. And we can look also at what their needs are, and why we do that is to say, okay, how can we tailor a program for this individual? If the person is a high-risk, high-need individual, they're going to need a structure of possibly an inpatient. They may need medically assisted treatment. They may need constant supervision by a DUI court. They may have to have a specialized probation officer. That's the folks that we're talking about that we really have to focus on. The low-risk, low-need person, as we've said for many years, those people, if you look at a bell curve, they're going to be far on the one side, on your left-hand side of it. The first time they saw that police car behind them in their mirror, the first time they saw those red and blue lights go off, and they knew what was at risk for them, they stopped. As you go further on that bell curve is when we have to start looking at the risk need factor to say, okay, how are you going to address the ones that are most at risk for recidivism, going back on the road again, drinking. So really what the risk needs responsivity principle says is focus in after you've had your correct level of care, after you've had your mental health, whether it be CARS or another type of program that looks to say, what are the needs of this individual? We then can tailor a supervision and a response based upon those levels that are present. Darren?
Oh, so under the issues here, as far as what we're seeing in our courts and seeing roadside and our toxicology screens, is a lot of multi-substance impaired drivers, which is included in this high-risk definition, along with repeat offenders and high BAC drivers. Can you and Chief Stevens tell us about these drivers and how often you're seeing them?
Well, I'll let the chief probably can say best from the roadside, and I can tell you how it affects us in regard to treatment and the courts afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Judge, and thanks, Darren. You know, I've been in this business for 4 decades, and I've always been a data person. I need the numbers, I need the data. That's how I operate. So one piece I'll throw out there is over the last decade, we've seen a 16% increase in alcohol impaired drivers killed in crashes who were also positive for drugs. But I don't really think that tells the answer. And the reason I say that is exactly what the top of this slide says. Impaired driving is the only crime where the investigation tends to stop after a police officer obtains a minimum amount of evidence. And what I mean by that is, and there are several things at play here. So as a police officer, this is a very complex and time-consuming issue when they make an arrest for impaired driving. We have the traffic stop, we have the development of probable cause, we have roadside sobriety tests, we may have a PBT, we develop a probable cause, we make an arrest, we're towing a car, we come to the station, it's going to take some considerable amount of time to process the arrest, a lot of paperwork. And here's what quite often happens. This almost tends to be a catch and release program for years, because the officer will ask the driver to take a breathalyzer. And if that breathalyzer shows a result of 0.08 or whatever your per se is, 0.08 or above, typically the officer believes, I have all the evidence I need now. Now it's just a matter of writing a report, writing the tickets, and closing this case out. And what I think we are failing to do is look further into the case to see if there's multi-substance use here. Is there alcohol and other drugs, sometimes multiple drugs involved along with alcohol? And for a variety of reasons, we're not gathering that evidence. I really believe we have no clue how many alcohol impaired drivers are out there that have been arrested that also had drug in their system, because they're not being tested often enough. And again, several reasons for that, Darren, because one of the reasons is it's going to take a considerable more amount of time to process this arrest if an officer believes that there are drugs involved. You have to have more probable cause to believe that. And then if you don't get consent for a blood or urine test, you're going to have to get a warrant, a search warrant to draw blood. Depending on what state you're in, that can be very difficult. Quite often, you're going to have to argue with a prosecutor over the phone on if you have enough probable cause developed for this case. And I'll briefly tell you about a case one of my officers had just last week. And we had a motor vehicle stop. Driver was arrested. He had 2 different types of controlled substances on his person during this arrest. Also alcohol in his breath. Now, my officer believed that he was probably under the influence of multiple substances. However, when a phone call was made to our state's attorney asked for all the information on probable cause. State's attorney said, well, you're not a DRE officer, so I don't think that we can successfully prosecute this, so I'm not going to give you a warrant or charges for driving under the influence of drugs. Now, this sends us into a completely different issue, is that we don't have enough DRE, drug recognition expert trained officers in this country. And it's unfortunate that in many court systems, prosecutors are relying on this. Say, if you don't have it, you don't have that certification, we're not moving forward. That's a problem, number one. Number two, a lot of our labs are ill-equipped, either staffing-wise or otherwise, to process a lot of these blood tests in an appropriate amount of time to be ready for trial. So that's another issue. So there are a lot of things that work here. And I think way too often an officer stops the investigation when they get that BAC result. And as a result of that, I think we really have no clue how many drivers are driving influenced by alcohol and other substance.
Judge Brace?
I mean, the question is really for your next slide is, why does it matter? You know, who cares? If the guy was arrested for drunk driving, he's arrested for drunk driving, you know, we're going to sentence him. Who cares about what does it matter? Well, it matters a lot, because as I said earlier, the biggest part of this is going to be an accurate screening for a correct level of care for treatment. Well, our goal here is change behavior at the end. It's not just punishment. Yes, we need to have to take care of punishment, but our true goal is change behavior, so the person no longer is getting behind the wheel of the car and under the influence. Under the influence doesn't mean just of alcohol, but it also means drugs. And when we're looking at that, can be illegal drugs or that could be legal drugs. We're not how many folks are out there driving believing that it's okay to take their prescriptions at whatever the level the doctor said, because, well, that's okay, the doctor gave it to me. The reality isn't, in today's world, we're now looking at legalized marijuana, and we're looking at medical marijuana. We don't know the depth of the problem with the persons that are driving impaired on our roads, which means if we don't know that problem, we can't treat it. If these folks are taking assessments and the assessment is only looking at their blood alcohol, and as the chief said, you know, a person could be only 0.8 or 0.9. In and of itself doesn't look like it's a problem, but all of a sudden it's 0.8, 0.9, and the person's on 2 other drugs at the same time. Houston, we have a problem. We have to deal with this. And unfortunately, because of the the problems that police officers and prosecutors face in regard to getting these cases in, whether it's cost, whether it's time, whether it's the fact that, listen, we already have the driving under the influence nailed with the blood alcohol. We aren't getting a correct gauge on the depth of the problem. Number two, more importantly, we aren't able to address the issue to change the behavior of the individual because we don't even know what they're on.
And Judge, I think you make a great point there, along with a point that you made earlier on cookie cutter justice, because for so long, and still, we have many agencies, they focus on detecting and arresting and convicting. And that's our cookie cutter justice. But we're never going to arrest our way out of this problem of the high risk impaired driver. We can't do that until we look at the whole system, and we're looking individually at each one to look at the root causes that are beyond the alcohol or drugs. Maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's also mental health issues as well, which quite often come into a scenario with a high risk impaired driver. So we have to make sure that we're doing proper assessments so we can get these drivers the proper help so we can stop the recidivism of the high risk driver.
And think about your officers, how frustrating it is for your officers to repeatedly be stopping the same people for drunk driving and them again seeing them back out on the street, whether it be a month later or 2 months later, 3 months later, going back driving again. And I say, really, whose fault is it? Is it the individuals alone, or is it also the court systems that said, listen, we haven't looked at the underlying problem here to address it? You know, instead of saying we're going to give you 10 days in jail, let's give you 30 days in treatment. Let's make it for a year, show that you're clean. Let's start to address the problem rather than just saying, well, we're going to arrest you and slap you in jail and think that that's going to cure the problem. If you went in as an alcoholic, if you went in with mental health illness, when you come out, you still have a mental health illness. You still have your underlying addiction problems. We need to have the correct assessments to make sure that we know what drugs they're on so that we then can look to see what level of care these individuals need and hold them accountable to make sure they get that treatment. And then we could deal with them afterwards.
And Darren, that's really what I meant by the catch and release program that I mentioned earlier. It seems like that's what we've been doing for years, because the mere fact that our high-risk drivers are being arrested again and again tells us that what we're currently doing doesn't work. We have to have a more holistic approach and treat each one of those individuals differently to determine what are the underlying causes so we can make behavioral changes so we can prevent them from reoffending.
Absolutely, and I appreciate both of you and your comments in showing how really this isn't just an individual. It's or actually a one size fits all. It's a very individual approach, but also how it fits in within the whole DOI system. We've been hearing reports from DREs and other officers where you might have somebody that's using multi-substances and they will use alcohol to mask that. And so when they get stopped, the officer zeroes in on the alcohol and may not be seeing some of those physiological responses from other substances that's leading to the impairment. So it's really, I think it's very critical as we go through the rest of this presentation, really looking at the whole system and how we make those changes. So I'd like to go to Joanne, and it's often said that impaired driving cases are the most complex cases to adjudicate in the criminal justice system, more so than even maybe a murder case. Why is that the case?
Thanks, Darren. And I'm just going to play off some of the things that Judge Barres and Chief Cass-Stevens had to say. These cases are so difficult because they are so multi-level. We start out these cases with the police investigation, which can be very lengthy and must be very detailed. We start these cases from the observation of the driver. What brought the attention of the officer to that particular vehicle? And we have to see all that driving behavior. What's different about this person that makes this officer think something is happening here? So we have to have a well-trained officer at the very beginning of this stage. Then we have that personal contact with the driver. We have to make observations how they appear physically, how they sound, how they smell. We have to have proper documentation of all of that, because remember, we are relying on the police investigation to tell us what led them to this decision, that realization that there's probable cause to believe this person is impaired. So we have 2 steps already where we've had interaction, we've had now observance of driving, we've had now personal contact with this actual driver, both in their vehicle, and if the officer now suspects something, they have to now get them out of the vehicle. And then they do what we call, as Chief Stevens said, roadside sobriety testing, to see how their ability to perform psychophysical tests. Can they actually perform everything that it takes to operate that 3,000-pound car, or as we often say in our field, that 3,000-pound missile? So we have that particular phase of the investigation. And then if we do someone is under the influence of alcohol or then under the influence of drugs, the case can diverge. Now we may have to call in an expert. We may need to call in that drug recognition expert, an officer with more training, more experience in detecting what category of drug that officer may be under. So now we have at least 2 witnesses that we would have to bring into this prosecution. And the drug evaluation that this DRE does is also very lengthy. It's standardized, it's systematic, it's done the same way with everyone who's arrested under the assumption that there's a drug involved, and they go through an entire lengthy procedure. Then we have to go and we ask the driver to give us a sample, whether it's blood, whether it's breath, whether it's urine, whether it's now an oral test, an oral swab followed up with lab. So now we bring in the science. Now we bring in an additional piece to this level of trial. So we're up to 3 or 4 levels before we even have the actual testing done of the substance in their system. Now we can proceed without a substance, and we do it all the time, based on the education, the training, and the experience of the law enforcement officer that made these observations and reached this opinion. But it gets more complicated when we have the science brought in, because now we have to rely on the labs, as the chief said, and our labs are often understaffed, underfinanced, are not able to do the testing that every other lab in the country may be able to do just for budgetary concerns. But now that's yet another witness we have to bring into the courtroom. And all of these components we have to educate our jurors about, because our average juror has no contact with this every day. So now we have multiple witnesses, some expert witnesses, which lead to some procedural issues in the courtroom. We have to assist our judge in learning new information, as well as our jurors, so that they can rule on certain issues that come up in the courtroom. And then the system itself for testing these chemicals comes into challenge. So we have to be prepared to address that. So I hope, and I think all my prosecutorial colleagues hope, and I hope that law enforcement and our judiciary also hope, that we're seeing this trend where more experienced prosecutors are taking on these cases and making it a passion. Because ultimately we want, just what the judges talked about, just what Chief Stevens has said, we want to change that behavior. We want that individual to not do this again ever. Not put themselves at risk, not put my family at risk, not put anybody else at risk. So we are now working, and with these educational tools, with these assessment tools, we are now getting to the bottom of why did this person commit this crime? Because it is also our responsibility as a prosecutor to assist in the sentencing recommendations for a convicted impaired driver. And without the knowledge of what is their background, what do healthcare professionals think about their mental health, their substance abuse position, we can't effectively give a good recommendation to the court. So we need to be able to understand all that, participate in that. We've now done it by holding the offender accountable, by taking them to trial, getting a conviction. But now that conviction, we're not going to change the behavior unless we take that accountability piece, and now add in those sentencing points that need to be addressed for that individual. So they're very complex, Darren, from start to finish. And as I say, I think we are all working together, and that's the key word. You have all used that word at some point since we've been on this call, and that's together. And it's that it goes beyond the three-legged stool. It's a multi-dimensional stool now to try to change that behavior and save lives.
Thank you. Just as far as our presentation, we are about 10 minutes from finishing. But Judge Brace, why do you think so many drivers often repeat this crime?
Well, one of the things that Jan was talking about, the multi-dimensional stool. Before we were looking at this as being alcohol, and now we talked before about alcohol and substance abuse. But one of the things that never had really put a lot of study into is the co-occurring disorders. What about the mental health issues of the individuals? What studies have shown is that of repeat DUI offenders is that 45% of those repeat drivers had a lifetime major mental health disorder. Another study found that 50% of female drivers and 33% of males, impaired drivers, had at least one psychiatric disorder. And these include everything from depression to bipolar to anxiety to antisocial personality disorders to PTSD. And so think about this. We are going ahead and we're saying, on the really bad side of the pendulum, we have the fact that they are going to some place and they're getting a film that they're watching about the dangers of drunk driving, and or maybe they're getting some individualized treatment in regard to alcohol dependency. But alcohol dependency in of itself does not look at the underlying mental health issues that go along with it. And for most of the programs that were set up over the years, it was meant for white males in regard to DUI, and it did not address the layering of different factors that really could be there for a repeat drunk driver. And then also, not only the identification of it, but then also the correct treatment of it, especially when you're looking at a lot of these when you're looking at groups for a DUI, they weren't gender specific. They weren't looking at any of the trauma focused care that's necessary. Wasn't looking at really wraparound services, wasn't looking at the mental health needs. So if you're not looking at those, you're never going to get the correct picture. If you're not getting the correct picture, you're not going to get the correct treatment. And if you don't, the cycle is just going to continue over and over again for the repeat driver. So as I said earlier, one of the biggest things is not only the screening, but just like we did with drugs, just to give you a quick one, Darren, we have a booking DUI center, and several years ago, what we did was we had every single person that came in was given a blood screen, and we found out that 60% had drugs on board of some type. Well, that's one part of it. That's what you're finding in regard to the individual, but let's look at the second part. What were we doing in regard to mental health issues? That same year, through CARS, we were able to institute a project program to study the mental health issues that were attendant to those individuals that are arrested for DUI. And to our surprise, and to my surprise, shame on us, over 60% of the individuals that were being tested had some type of function of mental health issues that had to be addressed. And they weren't. So if we don't look at that underlying problems, number one, if we don't make sure that they have adequate treatment, and it has to be done in conjunction with the drug and alcohol treatment, we are going to have that repeat drunk driver. And as we are aware, many of those folks that are doing the drug and alcohol counseling aren't necessarily equipped in regard to the realm of mental health disease and adequate care. It's not anything against them. That's not what they were trained in. So we have to make sure that we are utilizing the proper tools in the screening assessment for mental health issues, and to make sure it's available. Because if not, often our sentences are going to be useless if we're not tying in the appropriate treatment accountability for our participants.
So thank you very much. I'd like to move us to the next slide just quickly. And this is addressing some of the effective solutions that, that we're looking at. Some of these things are identified in the report. I know we don't have time to go into each of these specifically, but when we were talking about roadside testing, is being able to have officers with the standard field sobriety test training, maybe some oral fluid testing that some states are either piloting or actually implementing. e-warrant systems being able to help expedite that process, and then phlebotomy. So you're creating either a single chain of custody or reducing the number of witnesses that have to come into court for that. And then also our drug recognition experts, DOI court processes. All these things are within the report and outlined, or within our launch. So these are key elements that I think are very, very important. So the next slide is on the individual justice, but I would like to move us, and I don't know if we're going to have time to show the video from the Houston Sober Court, because I know we have a few questions that have come up in the chat boxes. But this is a powerful video. Let's see, we have till, I think, is it 1:30 or is it just 1:15?
Darren, are we able to share the slide deck along with the video with all of our participants?
Yes, all of this will be recorded. All of the information will be available to all of the attendees for today's meeting. So they will have all of this. I would like to have maybe a few questions that come in from the participants as well. So Leslie, do we have until 1:30, just to correct me?
Yep, we said 45 minutes, but if folks want to stay over a little bit, that's okay.
Okay. Well, I just was going to move us to this last section here. Is coming up in 2020, we do have a grant program that we've received a number of grants that have come in for this. We're very excited. We'll be announcing those at the end of June. It's around $250,000 that we'll be helping to support as part of our action-oriented process. And then many of those things are dealing with e-warrants, DOI courts, the CARS program, Ask, Listen, Learn, and how we can actually utilize the stophrid.org. So those are just a few things. I've got quite a few people that have commented that they would like to stay and watch the video. If we're okay with that, we can proceed. Leslie, let's just go back to the video quickly. It is 5 minutes. I don't want to keep too many people on the line, or going over, but I think this is really a powerful message about what we're talking about when we're addressing individual issues and individual justice.
Hello, sir. How you doing today?
I'm doing
good to see you. How's everything going?
Everything's good, man.
So this is the new spot. All right, give me a good strong blow. Good. This is probably going to be our last visit together. So I want you to close your eyes. Close your eyes. And I want you to think about everything that's on your criminal history. I want you to see each one of those charges. Okay? Now I want you to think about if we never introduced alcohol into your life, no drugs, no alcohol, ever introduced into your life, would you have a criminal history? Okay, look at me. Alcohol has not done anything to put money in your pocket, give you more time, or give you freedom. I want you to remember that.
Being in the US, I didn't know anybody. I have a daughter. I named my daughter after my mom. I was supported by my parents. Unfortunately, I lost both of them. And that's where I took that wrong road, which was drinking to make me comfortable and calm.
He was a classic example of somebody who pled guilty and just took jail time, did not get any kind of support.
Repeat impaired drivers are a very dangerous subset of population who consistently use drugs or alcohol and get behind the wheel of a car over and over and over. In a interventions prior to a DUI court really haven't worked for them.
I had the first DWI. I came out, I was sober for almost 4 or 5 years, and I got back to the same thing. I'm missing something. And what am I missing? The tools to help me in the situations where I need it the most.
Yusuf had that conviction on his record and was offered the sober court program on the second DWI.
The special thing about sober courts is that we believe in change. We believe that if we give clients the proper tools, they will be able to put them in place and not go back again and drink and drive.
We have named them sober courts, which stands for Saving Ourselves by Education and Recovery, but they are our DWI specialty courts. And the mission is to use an intensive rehabilitation program with a team concept to support the clients in their recovery. We do that through education, supervision, and treatment, and wraparound services, and that's the beauty of the program.
Not only do we have our awesome case managers that provide a lot of hands-on during the day, Sheriff Gonzalez has given us 3 deputies to do after-hour checks.
A lot of times you'll see, I'll get a tear in my eyes because it's almost like watching your children. You see the evolution. You see them evolve into the new person they're going to be sober.
The beginning was tough. Sober Court want to help people in addiction get out of it.
As the weeks went on, we started to see him really blossom. And I think that came out of some confidence that he was building as he was going to treatment and learning that he could be strong enough to not resort to alcohol whenever he faced adversity, because he has faced quite a bit of adversity in his life.
It has been a long journey. I faced a lot of big challenges in my life. Alcohol has been a burden for me, almost destroyed me. But luckily I had people like you guys to make me believe in myself, and I'm so grateful.
It's so much better for these folks because it equips them with lifelong skills that they are not going to get if they sit in jail for 30, 60, 90 days. In the end, he's been one of our greatest clients because he's done so well. He is committed to a lifetime of sobriety now.
Through that program, I learned if somebody can do it, why not me?
It's a powerful video. And for any of the venues in which you are operating in, this is a good one to explain, especially around impaired driving, is that even though they've had maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4, is that there is a way out, that there is hope, and that we can put systems in place for them. You know, as we conclude, I wanted to ask our panelists, say thank you very much, but also wanted to ask you, we'll start with Your Honor, and then go from the Chief, Joanne, is, in your professional opinion, what are 2 of the most important solutions that we need to implement to stop high-risk impaired drivers?
I strongly feel that from my end, early validated screening tools and assessments are critical, and the implementation of them at the earliest stages. And then second of all, for those that are at the highest risk, that we make sure that we have whether it be sober court, DUI court, whatever you want to call it, you want to make sure there's a multidisciplinary group gathered to help individuals through it, to make sure they have the proper treatment that they need, and the rest is up to them.
Well, Darren, I'd say from a law enforcement perspective, that's pretty easy. I think number one, actually, I think there's 2 game changers for law enforcement. Number one is the electronic warrant program for blood draws. Is incredibly successful in many court systems, in many counties, in many states. I think the expansion of the e-warrant program will really help law enforcement and prosecutors as well. And the other one is additional officer training, especially in 2 areas, DREs. We do not have enough certified drug recognition experts in law enforcement across the country. But the really second game changer, I think, is the police phlebotomist. Obviously, it's been incredibly successful in Arizona for years. It's expanded more recently to a total of 10 different states. But I really think that that solves a lot of the issues. As you mentioned earlier, it's going to save time. We're going to be more efficient. The officer doesn't have to bring in another witness, whether it was a firefighter that did the blood draw or a nurse or somebody in the ER. So I think those two programs, expanding those, would be incredibly beneficial on the law enforcement end.
Thank you. Joanne?
I think in addition to training our law enforcement officers, which I agree is absolutely critical to explaining not only how to identify an impaired driver, but to understand when drug impaired involvement comes into the picture. So in training our road officers with the HRID program, which is Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement, and then the DRE program, I agree with the chief, but that also applies to the prosecutors as well. We need to continue to support both from our law enforcement perspective and from the upper echelon and district attorney's offices or state's attorney's offices to give those prosecutors the training that they need to be able to handle these very complex cases. So that's critically important as we move forward in fighting this fight. And I'll play a little bit off of what the chief said and actually what Judge Brace said as well. And that's the use of all the new technology that's coming into our society in this fight, from ignition interlock devices to the new roadside oral fluid testing programs that we've been implementing, all these kinds of new pieces of electronics or technology, and the new pieces that are being developed to do these effective assessments, whether we call those technology or not. But those pieces are also critically important for all of us to understand the problem and then to address these offenders individually.
So thank you very much to our panelists. Is there any questions that we have from the participants that we can help answer in this remaining time? Leslie or Sam?
Darren, there's one that says, what suggestions do you have for labs to be able to perform most testing with limited resources?
Joanne, do you want to take that one?
I think, unfortunately for the labs, they are between a rock and a hard place in trying to make the determination of what gets prioritized in the lab. They are required to do testing for all types of crimes that occur in their community. And I think it's just a prioritization. I think that is in working with the highway safety offices in their state, working within their state crime labs to make that determination how they can best allocate funds and resources. It's very difficult. I am still a firm believer that one day we would have standardized protocols for all the labs across the country. And unfortunately, right now, we don't have that. Each lab is designing their own. Most of them are up to the same standards, but they do different types of testing. And a lot of times they're focused on what's actually happening in their community. So they have to be very in tune to their specific community and the needs there. But I ask everyone to support higher levels of funding for our labs.
We had faced this problem for years. You have a lab that's really, as Joanne said, a rock and a hard place. They've got rape cases that they're testing for, murder cases, drug cases, and now all of a sudden you're flooded with umpteen blood alcohols. We went to private vendors for all of our DUI cases. It's been really, for us, it has not been a problem, and it really has brought us quicker results. We see filings much faster, the appropriate filings much faster because of the use of private labs.
I was going to say, just with some of the toxicology, it is very difficult with, they have the different standards, but also for labs, I know it's a cost saving issue, is if they get a 0.08 or a 0.10, they sometimes won't look for other substances. And so if, looking at those policy changes, looking at how do we create funding sources are there some things within the DUI as far as either penalties or some fees that can be then cost recovery back that could go to labs that could actually help with that? Utilizing some funds from the state highway safety offices, some of their either their 405D funds or their 402 funds that could be utilized to help labs actually expanding their ability to test, or just some other options as well in the interim until you can move some things along, especially with your state legislators. We have a couple of minutes.
Darren,
else?
there's three more questions actually.
Okay.
Here's another one. This is for the judge. I have 4 children between 2 and 8. My next door neighbor just got arrested for his 9th DUI, and it's miraculously a misdemeanor due to timing since last violations. The DUI court, which he graduated from following his 8th DUI, is already contemplating taking him back in. Is a treatment-oriented probation program like this the solution for somebody like that? From a citizen perspective, that does not necessarily make it any safer for my kids to play outside in the cul-de-sac where we live.
And I can tell you that from my perspective, I can understand that. I was a district attorney for 3 terms and an assistant for 10 before that, so I know well in regard to the victim side. Here's where I struggle with. This person is going to go into jail as if it's a misdemeanor. Obviously, he's only going to go in for a short period of time. He's going to come out, and there still has to be some monitoring, some supervision. When we say DUI court, some people have the false image here. DUI court, at least in Pennsylvania, doesn't mean that the person is not serving any time. Often what we have is DUI court as a term of their probation or parole. So that if the person is going to have, the judge says, listen, you've had 8 times the plate here. I'm not going to just simply give you a house arrest or probation, but I'm going to give you a jail sentence plus, as part of your parole, is you have to go through the DUI court. So what we've now done is tailored both hold the person accountable by making sure that they're getting the jail time, that there's incarceration there to make sure retribution is done, and to also say you're not just getting away with this. It's not going to be a slap on the hand. But then let's just think about this from the other end. If we said no DUI court supervision and just put the person on regular supervision, they would be seeing their probation officer maybe once or twice a month. With DUI court, what you're doing is enhancing that supervision, and you're making sure it's tailored along with treatment. You want to make sure you have the best chance that your neighbor isn't going to be committing number 9. And so that the way to do that is to make sure, again, as was mentioned before, some people end up going to treatment several times before they get it. Our hope is change behavior. DUI court is not meant to be a place where you sing kumbaya and you just hold hands in a circle. It's meant to be a more strict way of enforcing the terms of supervision that include the appropriate treatment that they need to have the best chance to not go out there and commit number 9. But I can understand a neighbor's complete utter disgust in their mind with the criminal justice system if they feel it's just going to be another slap on the hand.
Thank you, Judge. Okay, here's another question. Do any of the panelists have any detailed information regarding Oklahoma's pilot program for marijuana testing that was recently approved by the legislature? It is voluntary and not admissible in court, but what technology are they using?
Yes, that they did pass that. They're in the process. It's with the Oklahoma Highway Patrol is going to be managing that. And at this point, it looks like it'll take a little bit of time. They have to go through a procurement process to identify the technology at this point. So there is more to come on that one, but we have been following that from responsibility.org.
Awesome. Do we know how many states, do we know how many states have these sober courts?
Almost every state has, well, when you say sober courts, it's just a nomenclature for DUI courts. Almost every single state has DUI courts in place. Now, it doesn't mean that there are many states that only have a few of them throughout the state. Others have them mandated throughout. You got a place like, and some of them have tied them into individuals getting their license back, which obviously better populates the DUI court because of the incentive to get your license back. And that, that's just another thing that has to, when we talk about the drunk drivers, the jail and the taking away their license, we know the repeat drunk drivers, it doesn't matter if they have a license or not, they're going back out on the road. So again, what's the appropriate response?
If you will look at our responsibility.org website under impaired driving, there, I believe there's a state resource that shows the different courts across the country. So if not, we can maybe look at to support, which ones and how we can help with the person that was asking the question.
Okay. So two more. Who in the department is doing assessments? The CARS 5 seems to take a lot of time away from a patrol officer. Any strategies?
We utilize it through our pretrial program, which is our probation department. So as soon as after a person is arrested and when they're preliminary hearing, they are placed on pretrial services. And if it's a DUI, then the CARS is utilized there by the pretrial program.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there's a variety of options of how each state and different courts are utilizing that. And there's some, I don't know, Joanne, if you have any response to that one.
No, I would agree with the judge. It's very often done in either that post-arraignment pre-trial phase. In a lot of jurisdictions, when someone is arrested for any kind of a DWI, whether it's alcohol, whether it's multiple substances in the system, that assessment is done immediately. It's asked by the court or it's asked for by the prosecution before we even go any further, because we want that information. Generally, our probation department, where I was a prosecutor in upstate New York, and our probation department would help facilitate getting that person together with their attorney to get through our Department of Health into certified assessors. So it can be multi-level. It can be a direct report to the court or direct assignment from the court, it can go through probation, or it can go directly from the defense attorney making that recommendation to their client.
The nice thing about the CARS assessment is it takes approximately 15 minutes, and there's some training that they go through, but they can help do those assessments, and it could be a variety of different people within that system that help do that. So I guess we have one more question, Leslie, and then we'll.
Exactly. One more. There's one question about the National Roadside Survey, so we can answer that directly and sort of add that to the summary, but this one's pretty important. So for the judge, my husband and 5-year-old were killed by a drugged driver along with treatment. Do you think that the penalties are stiff enough for a killing such as this? I am all for treatment, but there needs to be stiffer penalties. No, I see far too lenient sentencing.
Well, I think that number one depends on the circumstances surrounding it, but second of all, what state you're in and what the mandatory minimums are, and also as both the chief and Joanne will tell you, there are certain considerations often that the person is not pleading to the DUI homicide, but maybe to something different. Every state is different. I can tell you in Pennsylvania, we're looking at 3-year for a DUI or under the influence of drugs for a death. In some situations, I think it should be more. In other cases, for example, you have a person that's driving under the influence of a prescription drug, has no other offenses in their life, and you have to take into consideration maybe person's an elderly person. There are a lot of factors you have to take into there to say should it be more harsh of a penalty or not. Overall, though, obviously, if there's a death involved, that has to be an aggravating factor, and the judge should be looking at a higher sentence because of that. Joanne?
I agree, Judge. One of the things that we're trained to do as prosecutors is to look at every case individually. What were all of the factors surrounding this particular incident? Certainly, what happened to your family is devastating, and certainly we all give you our sincerest condolences. We look at that, we look at your position as a family, but we also look at what are all the factors surrounding this and what can I prove in a court of law. So we have to, every case is different. What could happen in your home if, say, you lived in Florida and I live in Virginia and our ultimate death is the same. I lost a loved one as well. The facts and circumstances of those cases could be completely different. So we have to look at them from every stage, all the stages that I talked about, all the stages that the judge and the chief have talked about individually to make the right decision. And those are very difficult, and they're very difficult on the victim's family.
Yes. There's I think there's a lot of things that have happened in our country. I think oftentimes people kind of see DUI as a lesser offense. We see some states that are incorporating felonies at a certain number, but ultimately you are operating one of the most deadly weapons that you could ever operate, even sober. And then as you're under the influence, the impacts, the tragedies that happen. And so that's where I think this call to action comes in is how do we help fix some of those gaps? There was a question that just came in, Leslie, and I think it's the second time, but you want to just ask that one real quick, just while we have the chief on the phone?
How do you convince those who have little faith? That one?
Yes.
Okay.
In the DRE program?
Yeah. How do you convince those who have little faith on the importance and need of DREs to prevent deaths and serious injuries?
Well, I'd say it's depending on who we're trying to convince, whether it be the police chief or the prosecutor or the judge. And it all comes down to education. For a police chief, you have to be a courageous leader. You have to realize the importance of programs like this, and you have to institute it within your agency. That may be seeking funding through your state highway safety office, working with your training agencies to get that type of training and certification for your officers, but it's incredibly important. And I've mentioned this several times already. It's difficult sometimes to get that training hosted. It's not easy training and certification to go through. It's not cheap, but it's incredibly important. And when you talk about the other two levels, the prosecutor and the judges, again, that goes back to educating the prosecutors, that goes to judicial education, explaining to those two levels of the criminal justice system the science behind it, the training behind it, and the importance of that certification to prosecuting a case.
Yeah, I would also add that in some states, their Supreme Courts have, had certified them as subject matter experts in that arena. And it's another area to look at to see if those have been deemed that in your state. But they have gone through an extensive amount of training and that process. So, looking upon who your audience is, that is a very critical piece, is to have that DRE well established to recognize as an expert. I want to thank everybody for being on. I know we've extended over. This is something that we could talk about for days. But I really appreciate all of our three panelists today spending the time, their expertise, the knowledge, and for all of those that have participated in helping to create this launch for StopHRID.org. I want to just say lastly is that Responsibly.org wants to accelerate support for states through the grant funding I mentioned earlier. We are available for technical assistance, presentations, and encourage you to scan the Responsibility.org's website for additional resources that we have for addressing underage drinking, our impaired driving programs, especially around that we've mentioned is the e-warrant best practice guide that we have created, a DUI courts, the CARS, the Ask, Listen, Learn programs, and others. And now with the StopHRID.org, is that we really are in a position where we would want to be a thought leader and an action-driven leader to help move along programs to end impaired driving. So thank you so much. And again, this will be has been recorded and will be available for you. So thank you very much. Be safe and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.